Greetings everybody, welcome to Billy Bobbers. Today I'm going to be talking to you about the Suzuki Intruder 1400. There are a lot of videos on YouTube about Suzuki Intruders, but some of them don't really address some of the crazy idiosyncrasies about this bike. I'm not going to tell you or demonstrate or even provide any videos about the build of this bike, the teardown of this bike, etc., 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 because one particular individual out there, and I'm going to give him some mad props right now, and you can look him up, Hagar, has done a really good job, and I don't think I could ever do a better job than he's done on the teardown and rebuild of a Suzuki Intruder 1400. So if any of you are currently looking to do a teardown and a rebuild of a Suzuki Intruder 1400 and you need some assistance in doing that project, I highly suggest you look him up and follow his string of videos. They're excellent. However, there are some things about Suzuki Intruders that aren't addressed, very subtle things about the carburetors that a lot of people do not talk about and have left many of us, when it comes to reinstalling carburetors after a rebuild, wanting. So today I'm going to try and address those things and let you know what I've learned since taking this project on. I'm going to start with the actual carburetor rebuild. So most of the time when we inherit these bikes, the carburetors are very, very bad. They're dirty, and especially in a dual carburetor or a multi-carburetor setup, the carburetors are going to be out of whack. One carburetor is going to be dirtier than the other, the jets are going to be screwed up, all of that, and that's going to require you, of course, to take those carburetors off and clean them up and reinstall all new parts, which is what we have done with this particular bike. In this case, as we were going through that process, it's not just simply taking all those parts off and putting them back on. You have to bench sync those carburetors to a specification as designated by the service manual. Some people assume that those settings are going to be the same for both carburetors, and I've read this quite often as I've been going through this process on many forums and even seen it on many videos, that most people make the mistake of assuming that on this particular bike, for example, the settings will be the same for both carburetors, and that's not true. So I'm going to address one particular thing right now that is specific. That's a mistake that I'm continually seeing with folks dealing with this motorcycle that they're doing on the front and back carburetor, and that's the pilot screw. The pilot screw on this one has a different adjustment for the front and the back. So to tell you about that, the front carburetor and the back carburetor, if you pull out the manual, and everybody has probably a different manual. For me, in my manual, on the specifications page in the fuel section, you'll see that there are two different columns for two different bike specs. In my particular case, I'm under the others column for this particular motorcycle. In the others column here, believe it or not, it's the same regardless whether it's a European bike or another's bike for the pilot setup. The front carburetor, to set the pilot screw, you're going to set it 2 3/8 turn out, which is really odd. I mean, in most cases on motorcycles, I have not seen this particular setting before. It's usually 2 1/2, 2 1/4, you know. It's usually 2 1/4, 2 1/2. It's set up in that particular case, but 2 3/8 is kind of an interesting setting. But 2 3/8 setting out, while the rear carburetor is going to be set 2 out. So the mistake that I'm commonly seeing in a lot of these forums and also on a lot of the videos when it comes time to bench sync or even set this bike up before you reinstall the carburetors is everybody says set them to 2. So when you go to do your vacuum syncing and try to use the cable to set things up, everybody's going, hey, my vacuum settings, they're just not setting up correctly. They're not lining up, and I can't get the front carburetor, in particular the front carburetor, to sync up. No matter what I do, it's not changing its setting, and that's because when the bench sync started off, it was set wrong. and nobody thinks to go back because they're thinking that sync cable is all I need to adjust. They're not going back and readjusting that pilot setting to the correct setting as a start point. So really that's what you need to deal with. The second thing that I'm noticing also too is that nobody goes back to the pilot screws when they're adjusting, when it comes time to start adjusting for synchronization. You're not just messing with that sync cable, you're going to have to mess with those pilots, because depending on your elevation, depending on the time of year, you know, the weather, the conditions, even the type of gas that we're using at that time of year, it's gonna require you to fiddle with it a little bit. The next thing that I wanted to address is, after you've done a rebuild, and I've got to change to a different page, after you've done or you're doing a rebuild, a lot of people neglect the float settings on these motorcycles. You have to pay attention to your float settings. The manual has a specific setting for the floats, and again, they're different because the floats are different on both of these carburetors. The front float is significantly different from the back float, and in that case, there is, again, if you go to the fuel and lubrication pages, you're going to find where it tells you a float height adjustment, and it has a section that gives you specifically what the height setting is for the top of that float in relation to the bottom of the float bowl seat. So in that particular case, you're going to have a millimeter setting, but also an inches setting. What I think is best in this instance is to use a digital caliper. Set your digital caliper to the correct height, and then what I do is I get a simple ruler and I measure it, and I use a piece of tape, and then I tape it off to that, so that I have, and this is not the correct setting, but then I have the setting that is called for on the table, so that when I go to check the float height, I put it, just set it on the float bowl cover seat, and I can check the float height right there against that tape mark that I know is correct because I set it by the digital caliper, and then I know to bend the tab accordingly to get that float set to the correct height. That's all you got to do. But those floats are important because you're going to need to set the correct gas in that bowl, so that your bike is being fed the appropriate amount of gas at the time, especially at startup and at idle. Otherwise, if your bike is starving for fuel and you're trying to get it to sync and you're trying to get it to run properly, you're just going to be fighting a losing battle. So these are the big things that I don't think they're necessarily big things, but these are the little things that I've found is a big problem with folks trying to get their Suzuki Intruder 1400s synced up properly, and somehow or another has been lost in the explanation of, hey, if you're going to sync your carburetors, if you're going rebuild your carburetors and sync your carburetors, these are some of the little things along the way that need to be done first before you start playing with your sync cable. And with that, man, hopefully this will help everybody get back on the road and get these bikes moving, because they're beautiful bikes, they work great, and man, they'll last forever. All right, till next time, I'm out. Billy Bobbers.